Welcome to the DISC debriefing video. In this video, I'm going to explain the DISC behavioral science in depth. Let's first start talking about the history of DISC. You can see that the history of DISC goes back a long time, but it really came to being in 1921 when Carl Jung developed the 4 distinct psychological types. So recently DISC became over 100 years old, so it goes way back. Now let's talk about some behavioral style facts. Every single person has a natural behavioral style. Every single person in your life has a natural behavioral style. It's also called a behavioral science assessment, not a personality test. So we're measuring your behavior, we're not measuring your personality, and it certainly isn't a test because you cannot fail the assessment. These tools are scientifically validated with reliability close to 90%. One thing that's really important to note is that all styles bring equal value to the team. And any style can do any job, but certain styles are more comfortable in certain positions. And the last and probably a really important takeaway here is that any individual can overcome the blind spots of their style through self-awareness and techniques. So as we're going through the explanation of the DISC behavioral science, really work to understand your style and then think of a couple techniques that you can use to leverage your natural behavioral style. So let's dive into the graphs. And if you go to your page 2 of your assessments, you'll be able to find the graphs. And in there will be the DISC behavioral style graph. And there's 2 graphs. The graph on the right is what we call graph 2, and that's your natural graph. That's your natural behavioral style. It's what we call the real you. It's really unlikely to change in your lifetime, and it develops around the time that you're 13 to 15 years old, and it's really locked in from there unless you go through or experience a significant emotional event in your life. Most people, their behavioral style is locked in their adolescent years, and it's their style the rest of their life. The graph on the left, graph 1, is what we call your adaptive style. This is your style at work, and it's how you adapt your style at work to best perform in your role. I see that most adaptation is subconscious. People don't say, hey, I'm going to be more outgoing today. It's just an effort they make. Or I'm going to focus on getting work done today. And so they drop their eye at work. So most of the time, adaptation can be subconscious. And we'll talk a little bit more about adaptation towards the end of the slide deck. So let's get into the traits of each characteristic. So when you first look at your DISC graphs, you look at the task orientation, which is the red and the blue bars, the 2 outside bars, and the yellow and the green bars, the inside bars, are your people orientation. Are you more task oriented or are you more people oriented? And so that's the first thing you look at. The second thing you look at is the score of each characteristic. The higher the number, the more intensity in that factor. The lower the number, the more intensity in that factor. Scores that are between 30 and 60 are what we call moderate intensity. So just recognize that a high score has the same intensity as a low score, or a low score has the same intensity as a high score. So you can see that in this slide, a person has 100 on their dominance, so very intense, very intense dominance in their style, but you can see they have a 6 on their S. And the lower that number goes, the more intensity there is as well. So that's important to clarify that a high score and a low score have the same amount of intensity. It's when they're in the middle that they're more moderate. So as we explain DISC, we start at its highest level. And then as we get into it, we explain it in more detail. So the D, the dominant, stands for dominance, and it's how you deal with problems and conflict. The I stands for influencing, and it's how you deal with people and contacts. Your S stands for steadiness, the green bar, and it's how you deal with pace and consistency. And the C stands for compliance, and it's how you deal with procedures and details. So let's dive in a little bit more. Why is knowing your DISC style important? First of all, it helps us understand who we are. It creates transparency. It creates self-awareness. And once we have self-awareness, knowing your DISC helps us understand how others are wired. And the one thing that a DISC graph tells you is how to effectively communicate to another person. So if you have a meeting with an individual and you're not exactly sure what their style is, look up their style in My Talent Planner and look at how you want to most effectively communicate with them. Effective communication is adapting your style in the moment. It's adapting your style to the person that you're speaking to so that you can have effective communication. Knowing your DISC also helps us identify your strengths and your growth opportunities. It really helps us understand what types of positions your natural style is a fit for. We call that skill set alignment or being home. And the last thing is that it dramatically increases productivity, job, and life satisfaction. I took my first DISC behavioral science assessment when I was 35 years old, and I wish I took it 20 years earlier. Now, let's get into each of the characteristics of DISC, starting with the dominance factor, the red bar. So when I talk about a high D, high dominance, I'm talking about over 60, 65 points would be considered a high D and very direct. And they are the gas pedal of the organization. They're typically very decisive, they're forceful, they really like to direct, they're ambitious. One of the Achilles heels, if you will, of the high D is that they have a very active mind. Their attention span is very short, and you have to really keep their attention. They can come across as very independent and confident, and they love a challenge. They love to take on a challenge. So that's the behavioral characteristics of a high dominance. Let's talk about a low dominance, which is more reflective. The low D is very laid back, they're cautious, they're agreeable, peaceful, patient, very deliberate, and they often take a very conservative approach. So that's the low dominance or the reflective style. What are the behavioral strengths of a high D? A high D, they want to win. They're resilient. They'll fight through any challenge. One of the strengths of a high D is that they're great at solving problems. They are problem solvers. They're very results-oriented. And probably one of the greatest strengths that Ds bring to the team is that their ability to have the tough conversations. Their ability to hold others accountable. That is probably one of the greatest strengths that a D brings to the team, as long as they do it respectfully and with emotional intelligence. And in the sales environment, if you have sales hunter on one continuum and you have the farmer on the other continuum, a sales hunter, a closer, is typically a high D. So let's talk about the behavioral strengths of the low D, the reflective. They're very calculated in their decisions. They're very level emotionally. They rarely lose their temper. They're great team members. They're cooperative. They're easy to get along with, and they stay calm. Those are the strengths of the low dominance. Now let's talk about the behavioral limitations of both styles. The high D typically lacks tact. They can over-delegate. They can dominate conversations and others. They have a tendency to overstep authority. They have what we call the shiny object syndrome, where they lose interest in projects quickly. They come into a room and have a tendency to fail to recognize other styles. They think that everybody's wired like a high D. And probably the Achilles heel of the D is the short wick on the temper. The emotion that goes with the dominance factor is anger. And so if an individual has a high dominance and a low emotional intelligence, typically their team will feel their anger at times. What are the limitations of the low D, the reflective? They typically take longer to make decisions. They can struggle to have the tough conversations and hold others accountable. They hope that it plays itself out or goes away. They may not stand up for what they believe in, especially if it's with a high D. And low Ds typically are lower task-oriented, and they'll hesitate and wait to address a problem. Those are the limitations of the low D. Some famous people in our population that have characteristics of a high D, LeBron James, Tory Burch, and old Vince Lombardi. There's only one place, and that's first place. There's no such thing as second place. So this whole concept of winning really came out in his words. All right, let's move on to the I, the influencing factor, and let's talk about the general behavioral characteristics of a high I. High Is like involvement with others. They have a tendency to know a lot of people, and if you know someone that's popular, they typically have a very high I. They're people-oriented. They get along well with others, especially they can get along with people they do know, and they can get along with people they don't know. They're verbally fluent, they're very trusting, and they're very optimistic. The low I, or the reserved characteristic, again, is very reserved. They can be introverted. They can oftentimes will take a pessimistic approach. They're logical in their thought process. They have very little emotions. They're not people-oriented, and you must earn their trust. One big difference between a high I and a low I is that high I's wear their emotions on their sleeves, and low I's really have a poker face, and you really can't tell where their emotions are at. Let's talk about the strengths of the I factor, the influencing factor. High I's, the outgoing, they build relationships. I mean, the strength of a high I is they know a lot of people and they build networks. They're very personable. When the team is struggling, the high I will try to be the glue to the team. They're very convincing, influential. They're great at networking. And often, when we benchmark a position for a marketing role, there's a high I in it because high I's are typically very creative. The low I's, the more reserved style, they make very fact-based decisions. Again, they have a low emotional state, so they make decisions based on the facts. They're productive. They get a lot of work done. They listen well because they're not talking. They're very task-oriented and oftentimes will play the devil's advocate. What are the limitations of the influencing factor? The high I, the outgoing, they have a tendency to talk too much, and because of that, they may be poor at listening. They overvalue people at times, really don't care about the details. Probably the Achilles heel of the high I, the outgoing, is that they have poor time management. You know, they get in at 8 o'clock, they get a cup of coffee, they go see a few people, they get another cup of coffee, and it's 9 o'clock. Typically, the limitation is they don't get their work done all the time, task completion. They have a tendency to overtrust, again, they may struggle at listening. The low I, the reserved, they'll think it but not say it, and that's a limitation, especially in a team meeting. They'll exhibit low levels of trust. They're typically pessimistic versus the high I that's optimistic. They typically can really kind of slow down the momentum of a team. They're not as people-oriented, and in a meeting, they'll be quiet and oftentimes need to be invited into the discussion. The emotion or the factor that goes with the I is trust. So you can see that the high I is very trusting and gives their trust away and maybe overtrusts at time, where the low I has to have their trust earned over time and may pull back on their trust based on what they learn about people. So trust is handled very differently between the high I and the low I. The high I gives it away and may pull it back. The low I has to have it earned over time. Famous people that reflect the high I, Oprah Winfrey, Will Ferrell, and Taylor Swift reflect some high I characteristics. Let's talk about the steadiness factor. That is the green bar. Let's talk about the high S first. What are the general behavioral characteristics of a high S? If you remember in the dominance factor, the red bar, that was the gas pedal. The high S is often the brake. It's like, hold up a minute, let's think this through. How is it going to impact the team and the people? So they are often the offset to the D. They're very relaxed and calm. They're patient. They like being with people they know. They like working with people they know. They typically have just a couple close friends. They listen well. They're very reliable and steady, and they like to serve others. The high S is the number one behavioral characteristic in our population. Around 38% of the population has a high S. The low S, or the dynamic, is very fast-paced. They always are on the move. They come across as very intense. The lower the score on the S, the more intense their style is. They're pressure-oriented, they're flexible, impulsive, and they feel like they just have a lot going on because they're moving. All right, so let's talk about the behavioral strengths of the S factor. When it comes to a high S, very team-oriented, really like the family feel of a company. They're great with current customers. We often call them the farmer because they're able to grow sales with current customers. Why are they good with current customers? Because they listen well, they serve, they follow up, they get their work done. They're very responsive and take great care of our customers. One thing that's really important to a high S is they like to work for a leader and a cause. So be that leader that they want to work for. They often are the anchor of reality. They get their work done, they're loyal, and they're logical. It takes a significant event for a high S to leave an organization because they are very loyal. The low S, the dynamic. They're multitaskers. They can manage a lot of things at one time. They can adapt quickly. They're going to move fast. They'll vocalize their emotions, and they're going to move projects forward. Those are the strengths of the low S, or the dynamic. Let's talk about the behavioral limitations of the high S or the steady. Probably the Achilles heel of the high S is that they internalize others' comments. And if they don't like them, they'll put them in what we call their backpack or their past pack, and they hold grudges. And if a high S is unable to unpack their backpack, that's going to get heavy over time and really start to sour the relationships of the people that are around them. So if you have a high S, recognize that one of the greatest limitations of your style is this backpack idea, and what is a technique that you can implement to unpack it. They take criticism personally, high S's do. They show no sense of urgency on the outside. Oftentimes they'll struggle to delegate. They'll think a lot of things because they have a lot going on up in their head, but they may not say it. And they like change to happen slowly. If change is happening on a consistent basis, they like to have a lot of communication around it. Let's talk about the low S and the limitations of the low S. Because they're moving so quickly, they're very poor listeners. One of the techniques that I use is to listen with my eyes. So I have a very low S. So if I'm talking to someone, if they're talking to me, I'm going to be looking them in the eye because that forces me to listen to them. So that's another technique that you can use if you have a low S. Low S's will miss details. They'll drop the ball once in a while. They'll struggle with people that move at a more methodical pace. They may engage too quickly and be too intense at times, and they certainly have patience is not a virtue, as we say, for low S's. Those people that reflect famous high S characteristics in our population, Brad Pitt, Aaron Rodgers, and Scarlett Johansson, are people that exhibit the behavioral characteristics of a high S. All right, let's talk about the last factor, which is the compliance factor, or the C, and it's pioneering on the low end of the C, and it's being precise on the high C. So let's talk about the characteristics of the high C. They're very objective. It's like, what do the numbers tell us, right? No emotion, just what are the numbers telling us? What are the facts? They often come across as pessimistic. They really seek high quality in the data that they collect. They're very precise. They're very analytical. And one thing to know about the high C style is they set high expectations for themselves and for others. And so if you have a high C, and you have high expectations of yourself, be fair with yourself, but also if you have high expectations for others, communicate those expectations to others so they have an opportunity to meet them. The low C, the pioneering style, they're very low in detail orientation. They're independent. They don't rely on a lot of systems. They're careless with details, but they can be very impulsive and also can be very opinionated. Let's talk about the strengths of the C factor, the compliance factor. On the precise end, or the high C, they are typically the smartest person in the room on their expertise. They're very technical. The higher the C, the more technical, and the more technical a person is about their craft. They're typically critical thinkers. They look to get return on investment in what they do. They'll follow the rules. They'll focus on quality. They keep great records, and one thing that a high C does well is they ask great questions. The low C, they keep things moving. They're very intuitive, and they're willing to take risks, and they'll even bend the rules sometimes if necessary to accomplish things. They show little fear in their day-to-day. They definitely don't sweat the small stuff, and they can make some quick decisions. Now, the limitations of the compliance factor, let's start with the high C. On the precise side, they can be very critical. They can get bogged down and lost in the details. They can become really too pessimistic. And because they want more details, they may hesitate to act. They may struggle to delegate. The way they think this through, the high C does, is, I could train them on how to do it, but I'm probably going to have to redo it anyway, so screw it, I'll just do it. So they don't, delegating is hard because they have such a high expectation of the work. They can be harsh on self and others, and if they believe in what they believe, high Cs can be very stubborn. Low Cs, they're going to miss details. They're not really good at the measurement side of things. They can procrastinate and lay off the detail work till the end of the week or the end of the month. They're going to make gut feel decisions, not use the data as much. Again, intuition. They can make underinformed or uninformed decisions, and they don't rely on process as much. Those that reflect the qualities of a high C in our world, Bill Belichick, Melinda Gates, and Kevin Costner reflect the characteristics of a high C. So this is a DISC behavioral style comparison chart. And it really just compares the 4 characteristics against each other, the primary need of each style, the emotion. Let's touch on the emotion a second. I did comment on the high D. The emotion that goes with the D is anger, so a high D has the potential for anger. A low dominance will not get angry very often. However, on that once or twice a year when they do get angry, everybody seems to know about it. The emotion that goes with the I is trust and optimism. High I's give their trust away, low I's earn it. There is no emotion that goes with the S factor because it's your pace of work. And the emotion that goes with the C is fear and risk. The higher your C, the higher your score, the more risk adverse, the more fearful you are in maybe making decisions. The lower the C, the less risk adverse you are and have little fear in making decisions. And it really depends on what the situation is as to what the right approach is. And then it also comments on what each style takes pride in dealing with. You can see that the D and the C are very task-oriented. The I and the S are very people-oriented. The D and the I are very externally facing typically, and the S and the C are very internally facing typically. Under stress, the D will become impatient, the I will become disorganized, the S will become possessive, and the C becomes very critical under stress. If you want to have an effective interaction or communication with a high D, you want to emphasize results and being efficient. With an I, you want to really focus on having fun in the experience. With the S, you want to build trust and reliability. And with the C, you really want to focus on information and process and systems. And so that is the comparison chart of the DISC behavioral styles and the 4 characteristics. The team wheel, this is something that will naturally be created in My Talent Planner. And the team wheel, so first thing you want to look at is where each person's natural and adaptive style falls on the wheel. If you cut the wheel in half horizontally, you can see that the C, the blue and the red are task orientation, and the green and the yellow, the I and the S, are people orientation. So do you have a more task-oriented team? Do you have a more people-oriented team? The other thing to look at the team wheel is, do you have good balance around the team? Like, are you missing any key characteristics on your team, like a high detail orientation or a high I or even a high dominance? And really have a discussion around what you learn from your team wheel. If the numbers are purely identifiers, so I'm an 18 is how you would use that. Actually, I'm a 13 on the wheel. The other thing about the wheel is that the farther out you are, the more pure or intense that style is. So for example, if you're a high promoter, if you're in the 15 box, for example, that means your I has a lot of energy and your other factors will have lower energy. So the farther out on the wheel, the more intense that factor is. If you're closer to the center of the wheel, that means that you have 2 characteristics that have similar intensity. So let's say your I and your C have similar intensity, or your D and your S have similar intensity, and that's what kind of pulls you to the center of the wheel. So the key to leadership development, the key foundation of leadership development is really to first understand your style. You have to understand it, and that's really what this debriefing video is about. It's helping you understand. It's helping you have self-awareness, because you can't lead others till you first lead self. So the first step in leadership development is to understand your style. Then the second step is really to own your style. And this is the most difficult part of the 3 steps here. I mean, it took me once I learned my style, it took me a couple years to own my style, because there's some things in my style that I don't like. And there's probably some things in your style you don't like either, but own your style. That means admitting when your style gets the best of you. For me, it's when my temper may get the best of me because of my high dominance, and at times I can show low emotional intelligence. So it's apologizing for when your style gets the best of you. Own your style. That is the second step. Once you understand your style and own your style, then you can leverage your style for huge success and create options in your life. Because the irony about life is you didn't get to create your style. You didn't get to pick it when you were born that you're a high dominance or a low dominance or a high S or a low S. You didn't get to pick your style. But to be successful, and especially as a leader, you have to own your style. And so really focus on understanding, owning, and leveraging your own style through this process. Now, what are the benefits of understanding, owning, and leveraging your style? First of all, you have greater self-awareness. Again, before we can lead others, we first have to lead self. Second is you'll understand how to better work and communicate with others by understanding your own style. And third, you'll be a better communicator because how a person wants to be communicated to is determined by their natural behavioral style. So with my style, high D, low S, be brief, be bright, and be gone, right? Let's have a really quick interaction and we're back to work. When you understand and own and leverage your style, you're going to enhance your job fit. Find a position that fits and leverages your natural behavioral style. The fifth thing here is you're going to be a better leader because once you understand how to lead with your style, then you can obviously help others understand and own their style. And that goes to the next point of being the shepherd of the talent. The shepherd of the talent, once they understand, own, and leverage their own style, now they can help others understand, own, and leverage their style. When you understand, own, and leverage your style, you're just going to have healthier relationships, both at work and at home. To accelerate your personal growth, understand, own, and leverage your natural behavioral style. To accelerate growth of your company, department, and home life, help others understand, own, and leverage their natural behavioral style. It's time to accelerate growth.